Hello folks, and welcome back to World War II TV and the concluding part of our Airborne week, which, no pun intended, seems to have flown past. I've had a lot of fun doing it. The viewing numbers have been quite good considering it's August and people are on vacation, holiday and traveling around. It's been really good, and I like the variety of subjects we've covered. So today we are in the ETO again, but Sicily this time, 1943, and my guest is the author of this rather good book, The First Bridge Too Far, The Battle of Primosole Bridge, Mark Saliger, who is joining me from England, and he's making me look very underdressed because he's wearing a tie, but never mind. It just makes me look less sophisticated. Anyway, good evening, Mark. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good, thanks. You?
Good. So, first thing, ex-para, one of your first projects in terms of history. What drew you to the Sicily operations? Why didn't you perhaps try something that everybody's done before, like Normandy or Market Garden, or what drew you to Sicily?
Yeah, I think it is just that. A lot of the history of the parachute regiment is well known, particularly Normandy and Arnhem later on. A huge amount of material out there on those. And when you look through the records, the Primosole Bridge operation, which we're also going to go through now, a lot of the same guys that fought at Arnhem actually fought at Primosole Bridge 1 year earlier. Hence the title of the book, The First Bridge Too Far. So it's in kind of respect to Arnhem that when the guys were fighting at Arnhem, they got a lot of sort of representation and coverage on that. A lot of people didn't know that these guys actually fought the same very similar battle in Sicily a year before. So it's very much putting that story out there to a wider public.
And of course, we can't help but notice during the show that there'll be these parallels. There were things that went the similar ways. There's issues with accuracy, drop zones, distance, speed of reinforcements coming in, resupply, the kind of the universal problems, dilemmas of airborne forces, which will connect very nicely to those who've been with us all week with Prit Butar. Yes, you're talking about the Russians, and Greg Way on Monday talking about the Germans in Crete. So there's lots of parallels. That's the interesting thing about airborne operations, because you can connect the dots. Anyway, as usual, Mark has come prepared with a PowerPoint presentation, which we will work our way through. So as usual, folks, what will happen is I will kind of kick Mark off to start going, and then I will jump in with comments that I have, points to clarify. We've got maps, we've got video I took in Sicily a few years ago. And if you've got questions coming in, then please fire away. But as far as I'm concerned, over to you, Mark.
Great, thanks a lot, Paul. So through the intro, it's kind of putting this battle out there, Primosole Bridge. The Sicily campaign is fairly well known, but not in as much detail, for example, as Northwest Europe and other campaigns. And particularly the Primosole Bridge, it's not very well known at all, even sort of within the parachute regiment circles. It's known as a battle honour with a rough outline of what happened there, but the detail of it isn't particularly well known. And I think it's that key comparison later on with Arnhem that's so significant and often overlooked. So there's a huge amount of interest from this battle, which was carried forward to Arnhem, lessons learned and lessons not learned. So we see here as the North African campaign was drawn to a close of 1942-43. The Allies are looking at next steps already. Also, you see in this picture here, Churchill and Eisenhower, amongst others, they started planning in January 1943 in Casablanca the next steps. So they're clearing out the North African campaign, and then looking at striking into Europe from there. Four main options they had, working from sort of west to east across the Mediterranean. Firstly, southern France. It was deemed at the time to be too long a sea route, and it was actually delayed a year to then coincide with the Normandy landings and then do a pincer movement through France. The second option, Sardinia, Italian land. Again, it's a fairly long sea lane and air route, but then it could be used as a springboard against Rome later on. Option 3, Sicily, the shortest sea and air route, and then again a springboard into Italy later on. And option 4 was the long sea route towards Greece. Again, that was put back to later in the war. So 4 main options there for going next, and Sicily was the one that was eventually picked. 3 main objectives that were given. One was the pressure from the Russians to open a second front. Number 2 was to knock Mussolini and Italy out of the war, and number 3 was to open the sea lanes between sort of Gibraltar and Malta. So the 3 sort of key objectives. That's why Sicily was chosen. And within that plan, Montgomery, as you see here in his parachute regiment Berry, he was commanding the British forces and very keen to use the parachute regiment, and that was based on their actions in North Africa. So the parachute regiment was only sort of 2 years old at this point. And in that short time, they already had 3 battle honours. Just to sort of quickly recap, the first one was in Bruneval in northern France, led by Major John Frost at the time, who would then feature heavily in Primosole Bridge and Arnhem to capture a radar station in France and bring it back to the UK. And then 2 operations in North Africa, which is where they really cut their teeth ready for Primosole Bridge and later for Arnhem. Number 1 was Udna, 2 para again led by John Frost, parachuted in behind enemy lines, cut off and had to fight their way back to Allied lines. And then Tamara in Tunisia, where 3 para went into the line as line infantry and were fighting against the Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers, for the first time. So that's the first time the 2 paratroopers had met on the ground. And it was whilst in North Africa that the paratroopers were both given their sort of respective nicknames as well. So the British paratroopers were named the Red Devils. It was picked up in intercepted radio communications that the German paratroopers had earned their respect and called them the Red Devils. And then vice versa, the British paras are called the Germans the Green Devils. So you can see kind of already what was happening there. 2 elite formations squaring off on the ground, and they were soon to both parachute into Sicily. It'd be the first time the 2 airborne formations, enemy and friendly, had parachuted in and were fighting on the ground.
And just to jump in, Mark, this whole idea came up yesterday with Pritt. This idea of, despite the difficulty of some of the campaigns and the hard fought nature, there was always this respect between airborne forces on the ground for each other because of this shared idea of what they've been through to get through the training. They're kind of outsiders within their own army because the airborne forces are new in all the armies. They've got this status of being better and elite, and I hate the word elite, but I'm using it there. And so it's always this idea that there's this level of begrudging respect between these forces, and the fact you always give a nickname to someone you kind of like in that it's respect, but it's connection as well.
Yeah, and you can see between the 2 formations, it's sort of simple things that cross over as well. So to differentiate themselves, the British start wearing the scrim nets on the helmets, and it's just that sort of kit and that image of the paratrooper. Obviously, the maroon beret of the British Parachute Regiment is now worn by all airborne forces across the world. So there's always that kind of airborne brotherhood regardless of nations. And it was after sort of the battles of North Africa, where the first Parachute Brigade is what we're looking at in the Primosole operation. They were first given the objectives of Brigadier Lathbury, the commander. He was the only one who kind of knew that the operation was going to be Primosole Bridge in Sicily. So at the time in North Africa, they started preparing for a series of exercises called cactus exercises, parachuting into the desert and marching towards a bridge. That's all they knew at the time. And this would be, as the brigade sort of went through North Africa, it's battalion-sized jumps, moving up to Primosole, which would be a brigade-sized jump. So the first time in British airborne history, a brigade-sized jump, which would involve pathfinders for the first time. It would involve air landing artillery for the first time, and a whole surgical unit operating theatre would go as well. So, and all 3 battalions jumping together. So a huge operation. They practiced in North Africa, as well as practicing in North Africa. It sort of highlights the infancy of parachuting at the time. They were getting new equipment all the time. So the Dakota plane came online for the Brits. So previously they were jumping through the floor of a Whitley aircraft, very slow, and you can only get 3 or 4 guys out over a drop zone. Once they're standing up with the Dakota, you're able to push sort of 15 guys out the door in the same space. So the parachuting technique was advancing all the time. And also the paratroopers themselves, they were getting more experienced in jumping. They were starting to experiment jumping with rifles on them, actually on the man, rather than the canisters, which went underneath the planes, which we'll see later on were lost quite often on the ground. So yeah, so the order of battle was starting to sort of settle itself in, and the guys were basically preparing to go into Sicily now. As you see here,
just to interrupt again, this idea that the success the airborne forces have been having has been on a fairly small scale basis, where you kind of go in, there's no need for reinforcements, that you've got one smallish group of men in one place. I mean, Bruneval, that particular raid just up the road from me, was typical of that type of operation. And indeed the other nations, as we discussed on Monday, the Germans, their experience in 1940 was mostly small scale things. And then when it got bigger towards Crete, of course, then the problems started coming in. So there must have been a sense. I mean, your book talks about it. This awareness amongst the British Airborne that as they go bigger, then the more loose ends there are, the more moving parts there are to an operation. Then the risk is increasing, despite the fact you're committing a larger force. The complication of that is increasing. And did in your research, is there a feeling of this scale increase putting a bit of pressure onto the airborne forces?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more moving parts, and just to go back as well. One para in North Africa, they're advancing towards a drop zone, and Lieutenant Colonel James Hill was basically hanging out the aircraft door with his binoculars as he got close to an objective to find a sort of suitable DZ. When he was happy, he'd stand up and jump, and everyone would follow. That's kind of how the early days of parachuting were. So then to take that on in a very short time, to then be looking at brigade level jumps in Primosole against a key strategic objective with artillery coming in and pathfinders, and you can see how it's developing there, and it's added more pressure onto the unit, but obviously it's something they were very keen to take on board. So and here we can see this is a view of the south end of Primosole Bridge, and it's looking towards, you can see in the distance some high ground. This is the Johnny 1 hill, which is basically a key feature later on in the story. So it's showing that the bridge itself is basically across the Simeto River. We see that on the map in a minute, but the very, very flat level ground is at the base of volcano Mount Etna in Sicily, so very limited high ground. So this was a key feature looking south, and that's where 2 para would later land and fight. So yeah, if we look forward to the map here, you can see coming from sort of the left of the screen, you've got the rivers, the Gornalunga Canal, the Simeto River, and they all come together in one place, which is the Primosole Bridge. So rather than affecting 2 or 3 river crossings, you can do it all in one fell swoop at Primosole Bridge, and that's also the strongest bridge needed to support the Sherman tanks. So that's the key plan and why the bridge was selected. So the brigade was earmarked and were training in the desert to look at that objective, but obviously they were unaware of where the bridge was. Only Lathbury, Brigadier Lathbury was aware of the plan. With a couple of days before the Sicily invasion, the brigade were then briefed on what their roles were going to be, down to sort of brigade level. And I think we could see some of the arrows on the map now. So the plan to take the bridge, and the first 2 red arrows you see, this is 1 para. We're going in 2 sides of the river as a coup de main force just ahead of the main body. They would land 2 companies of men, so about 100 men each company, and basically advance on the bridge and take the bridge. Again, obviously, we're talking about Arnhem later on here. So this bridge has been taken from 2 sides of a river by a coup de main force. Arnhem later on wasn't. To the north of the screen there, you can see B Company 3 para. They would also come in ahead of the main body, and they would take out an anti-aircraft battery to the north. Obviously, the idea being to take out the main anti-aircraft and capture the bridge before the main body then come in. Moving on, the bridge at this stage would have been captured, as well as the anti-aircraft battery. Then you see the 2 red arrows again, so that's the main body of 1 para now landing, moving in to reinforce the bridge, as well as 3 para to the north would now land, and then block the main road to Catania to the north, which is seen as the main enemy threat, large city and port to the north, as well as some airfields. Next to the south, you see 2 para. They would land on DZ3 and make their way around the south in a sweeping maneuver to basically capture 3 hills, Johnny 2, Johnny 1, Johnny 3, named after Johnny Frost, the commander of 2 para himself, and then settling on top of all 3 hills, and they would be covering the road between Johnny 1 and Johnny 2, because as well as German troops advancing from the north, there's also the Seabourn invasion would push German and Italian forces from the south up towards the bridge as a retreating point. So you see the bridgehead will be getting squeezed from both sides, attacked from the north and potentially retreating German forces from the south. And then last but not least, the gliders would come in on the landing zones, the yellow arrows, and for the first time in airborne history, they would land artillery, which would be pushed out to 2 and 3 para positions, as well as the bridge.
And like
and
all
how that's
plans
going
are,
to
it's good on paper there. And
do.
I mean,
Yeah.
this is the one I really, for people who are less familiar with the terrain of Sicily, and I have been there 3 or 4 years ago, and it is, you know, we're talking the eastern side there, and this is, you know, I'll let you explain the landings of the beaches, but I think that whole Monte pattern race across Sicily has rather overshadowed everything else that happened in Sicily. I think people forget there are Canadians there, for example. They forget about all that because it's become about so many people, this ego battle between these two generals, who of course you can't ignore in the talking about Sicily, but I think it's rather made that this airborne operation has become second fiddle to that. But I've added another there. This is for those who can understand there, the plain there, there's Primosole, there's Mount Etna at the north there, and you've got the reason that they have to come across this way is over here is just terrain that is not suitable for large advances. There's no big logistical route through those mountains there to get towards the north, to get towards the objective, which is Messina. You're kind of going to go that way up the coastal plateau mark as well. The British are. The Americans are going the other route, as we now know. We'll just watch the Patton film and you'll get that debate of which way Montgomery and Patton are going. But that area there, the plain, I'll let you explain more about there. But anyway, you did already. But again, rather than having several bridging points over here, take it all in one place there and then bring reinforcements up. And also, with it being flat, it's better theoretically for airborne forces. Doing stuff over the mountains has been more difficult. So, you know, your ex-para, I know you know what happened in this operation. I know what happened in this operation. But try and imagine if you had seen this plan. Does it sound good? A good plan? If you're a platoon sergeant or something, and you get this plan given to you, would you have felt confident about it? Do you think?
I think on paper, yeah, it's a good plan. I think it's said that the battlefield itself is very limited in that it's a bridge with hills to the south and then very flat ground. So there's not a huge amount you can do really. So I think the sort of defensive points and the main threats were fairly obvious. So yeah, I mean, one para ring off the bridge. Obviously keeping that for Monte as he advances, and then 2 para to the south, stopping any retreating Germans, and using that very scarce high ground, which then dominates the bridge and the surrounding area. And then 3 para, obviously the main sort of enemy threat would be coming from Catania. So on paper, it's a sound plan, and it was obviously part of a larger airborne drop as well. So very similar again to Market Garden later on with the airborne carpet. This is the third of 3 airborne operations, British airborne operations planned for Sicily. So we can touch on the next slide. So on the very first night, the opening sort of shots of the Sicilian campaign were a glider operation in Syracuse, the Ponte Grande, which was non-paratroopers. This was glider-borne British infantry, and as they flew towards the coast, a lot of the American pilots released the gliders too early, and obviously you can see one in the sea there. So exactly half, 72 out of 144 gliders were short and went into the sea that night, and only one glider landed on target out of 144. But that one glider managed to take the bridge. To 30 men that were on that glider managed to secure the bridge until they're beaten back the next morning because ground forces didn't arrive to relieve them in time. So there's that pattern. Obviously, we see that. We're going to see it later on at Primosole Bridge and Arnhem as well. And then the second operation was a 2 para brigade, so 4, 5, and 6 para, were to land and take the port of Augusta, but ground forces overran that, so that was cancelled. So Primosole Bridge was a third of 3. And it was again this kind of Montgomery Market Garden piece that later on is this airborne carpet, and the ground forces drive over towards Messina. So that's the sort of where Primosole Bridge is in the bigger plan. But I said the first operation, Operation Ladbroke, half the gliders ditched in the sea, huge casualties. Took the bridge, but then lost the bridge due to not being relieved by ground forces. So warning signs were there, and the potential of airborne forces were there, but obviously it wasn't realised on the ground. And then to touch on the Americans as well, they used their airborne forces slightly differently. So not capturing key strategic pieces, more kind of moving troops in to fill gaps in the line. So the Americans on the first night, they were dropped. Most of them, bulk, were dropped 25 miles away from the intended drop zone, which left a gap in the American lines. So a few days later, they flew in another batch of the 82nd. As it flew over the Sicilian coast towards the Sicilian coast, it was shot up by friendly fire by ships out at sea. Losing 23 of 144 aircraft shot down, so huge losses, and the airborne forces were basically grounded. and this went up to Eisenhower and Churchill, the highest level, to find out what happened to airborne forces. So huge lessons on the first couple of days of Sicily, and still with Primosole Bridge to come. So that was sort of the intro, the airborne elements of the Sicilian campaign. So a pretty disastrous start, but it could show that even with small numbers, targets could be captured.
Yeah.
And then moving on to the Seabourn Landings. So the next morning, Seabourn Landings went in. 105 mile off Sicilian coast was basically used, 26 beaches. So a huge landing, one of the biggest amphibious landings of the Second World War. And as kind of planned, it was kind of lightly defended by mainly conscript Italian troops on the coast. And the sort of the elite Italian and German forces were held inland, as seen later at Normandy and other places. So fairly unopposed landings, but not completely unopposed. And then troops started making their way off beaches into the sort of rugged interior of Sicily, and that's where they started finding the real defensive lines, particularly from Hermann Goering German Division and the Italian Livorno Division, and that's where we start seeing sort of resistance inland. And the plan then was set in motion to try and accelerate that, as Montgomery was already being concerned about Messina. So the code word Marston tonight, Marston being Primosole Bridge, was sent to one Para Brigade to start basically planning to come in that night. At the same time, and this is kind of a key defining feature of Primosole Bridge, the same time that was happening, the Germans also recognised the importance of Primosole Bridge, and then sails flew in the Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers, that night, landed around Catania in 3 waves, and immediately moved to Primosole Bridge and began occupying the whole area around Parachute, where the Parachute Regiment were going to come in the next night. They actually sat on 2 Paras DZ, the Fallschirmjäger, and they're awaiting their own airborne troops to land at the same time as the British Paras were scheduled to land the next night. So the tactical and strategic importance of Primosole Bridge was just becoming bigger and bigger, with key players and key reinforcements coming into the island to protect the bridge.
And how was the Allied intel at this point in terms of getting these updates about the German Fallschirmjäger arriving and things like that? Because we are aware from earlier in the campaign, the Ultra and things like that are giving the Allies a helping hand in knowing what's happening. But given the speed again that these operations are being mounted, and the recurring theme this week has been how swiftly airborne operations are actually put together in the fine detail. Normandy really is the exception of it having months and months of planning. Most airborne operations are days or a couple of weeks at most. So what was the intel for the Allies in understanding what the Germans might be able to bring into play, and particularly in the case of the Fallschirmjäger?
Yeah, I mean, the Fallschirmjäger Sicily, their insertion was an absolute masterstroke, completely under the radar, literally. So only 5 days previously was the Battle of Kursk in Russia. So that drained all the German reserves, moved out into Russia, and then Sicily happened 5 days later. So that left the Germans in a rapidly deployable division, which was the Fallschirmjäger, who were based in southern France at the time. So literally that evening, 3 officers landed in Catania, found the drop zone, and called in the Fallschirmjäger that night. That's how quick they came in, and they timed their jump as well to be in the evening. So they knew the RAF and the Allied Air Forces were operating during the day, and at kind of 6 o'clock in PM, they kind of went home to the airfield for tea for the night and didn't reappear to the morning. So they literally appeared unopposed and jumped around Catania and Primosole Bridge unopposed within seconds. That's kind of how airborne forces work. Just 3 guys landing, finding the drop zone, and the rest following in. So, and it went completely under the radar of the Allied plans, unaware
that insertion of the Fallschirmjäger there, to me, is one of the absolute symbolic examples of what airborne forces could and should be used for. That absolutely rapid, sudden, immediate arrival somewhere that completely surprises the enemy. And the counterpoint of that, of course, is that the more, as we've talked about, the more complicated the operation, the more moving parts, the longer it takes to get it together, the more aircraft that are involved, and therefore time is always a factor there. And it's like we said with Prit Butard yesterday, this eternal paradox with airborne operations of the balancing speed and swiftness of seizing an objective with this resupply and bringing in a big enough force that can sustain itself for some time. And You know, we were talking before going live, folks. I don't know that any country really mastered that balance in World War II on a large scale of how to use airborne forces as perfectly. I don't think there is a perfect, but I'll hand it back to you. And so we now know, unfortunately, the Fallschirmjäger are on the ground there, and but we've now, was there any decision, any point where this plan may have been abandoned or changed? I mean, I know they don't know the Fallschirmjäger there, but as things are changing with the landings on the coast, is there any room for maneuver with this plan, or is it just going to go as off paper?
Yeah, I mean, so the plan was delayed 24 hours to allow the ground forces to catch up. So it was actually put back 24 hours. But yeah, the presence of the Fallschirmjäger was completely unknown. Again, another sort of similarity to Arnhem, where obviously Panzer troops were at Arnhem, which wasn't known at the time. So I think if they'd known the Fallschirmjäger there, it would have been certainly different. But again, I say the main threat was coming from Catania. Once the Paras landed and captured the bridge, you're then expecting that to be known by enemy forces and then attack you from the ground. You weren't expecting to be landing on top of dug-in Fallschirmjäger who are waiting more reinforcements. So it's a massive intelligence gap there, which potentially would have hugely altered potentially the drop zones. Definitely, you wouldn't be jumping on top of Fallschirmjäger dug in with a heavy machine gun battalion. So yeah, it wasn't known, and obviously the operation carried on. So the slide we're seeing here is the air route. So this was kind of lessons learned from the glider and 82nd Airborne operations in Sicily already. So it's kind of as simple as you can get it, air route and staying off the coast. This was the idea. So the air armada for Primosole Bridge, Operation Fustian, so 133 aircraft, 16 gliders, so that was carrying nearly 2,000 men, 428 weapons containers slung underneath the aircraft as well, and all this would happen within a 2-hour jump window across 4 drop zones and 2 landing zones for the gliders. So a huge amount happening, and you can see from the route it went in a dead straight line out to Malta. 6 huge searchlights were lighting up at Malta for the planes to aim for, so nice and simple. And Eisenhower was actually standing there watching the aircraft come over, and he had his customary 7 lucky coins in his pocket that he was rubbing together as he watched the aircraft go over. And then skirted around Sicily, and the Navy had been pre-warned there's an air armada due in, so they were basically had a clear lane and to not be fired on if they stuck to that lane, stay out at sea until level with Primosole Bridge, and then come inland. So that's the only time they should be coming inland and incurring enemy ground fire. As they near the coast, a lot of German planes and Italian planes were in the air prior to this, so the Navy obviously were on alert. And there's still some sort of ACAC and anti-aircraft fire going up in the sky. So as the air armada drew near, it began to scatter almost immediately, and some of these pilots were the same pilots that on the glider and 82nd operation a few days before, so they didn't really want to see any more ACAC. A lot of the pilots, a lot of planes at this point turned around without even facing fire and went straight back to North Africa with their full sort of cargo of Paras on board, and due to scattering of the aircraft formation now, they moved out of the air route, so they started being engaged by friendly forces, naval vessels on the ground. 11 aircraft damaged straight away from their own side, further breaking up the formation now. So planes are all over Sicily and all over the sea. And as they obviously entered the coastal region, they're hit by coastal defences. And then last but not least, as they started approaching to the drop zones, they were then hit by the Fallschirmjäger. The machine gun battalion itself took down 3 Dakotas and 2 gliders with pre-sighted machine guns. So a massively scattered drop. A lot of pilots just trying to sort of get in, get out. So a lot of the jumps were from 200 feet. So barely time for the parachutes to open. A lot of guys were sort of hitting the ground with parachutes hardly open, a lot of broken legs, a lot of injuries. The 2 para adjutant, Major Victor Doe, was actually landing on the Mount Etna volcano, sort of 15-20 miles to the north. We fought his own kind of, with another guy, fought a kind of 2-man behind the lines battle for a few weeks. Alistair Pearson, the CO of 1 para, his pilot was attempting to return and go back to North Africa with the first sight of enemy aircraft, and Pearson actually went into the cockpit with a pistol in hand and basically ordered him to basically take him to the drop zone. So there's actually a guy from the RAF in the back of the plane who was now in the Paras who could actually fly the Dakota. So that was Pearson's threat to get his pilot to drop him onto the correct DZ. So a massively scattered jump, certainly not organised as per the plan. And it was just kind of, as soon as they hit ACAC near Sicily, the whole jump kind of was out the window. And just to sort of throw a few kind of stats out there, so only around 300 guys out of nearly 2,000 actually landed on the ground, and 147 out of the 428 containers were found. So as soon as you hit the ground, you're down to 1 in 6 men with about 3/4 of your weapons missing. So that's kind of what you're looking at. Of the 133 aircraft that came over, 39 landed within half a mile, but scattered, so not on the drop zones. And 25 returned to North Africa with all of their paratroopers still on board, and 17 had part of their paratroopers on board. So it became apparent back in North Africa when the planes began landing earlier than expected, and then paratroopers fully laden for battle were coming off these aircraft, clearly not been into battle. The planners started realizing something very serious had happened here, and didn't take very long to sort of add the numbers up and realize there's a very, very limited number of guys were actually on the ground. And the gliders that were coming in slightly after the aircraft fared even worse. 12 out of 16 didn't make it, so 6 being shot down, and 6 crashing on landing. So a very scattered drop. And what this kind of leads to, you'll see here, this is the actual regimental diary from the CO3 Para. I'll let you kind of read through some of that, but it basically says there at the bottom that 3 para were down to 6 men from a battalion of about 600 guys. You're down to sort of 6 men. So the CO is Batman, the RSM is Batman, and 2 guys from the intelligence platoon. So that just shows you the sort of the effect on the fighting troops on the ground of a dispersed airdrop.
But just to interject again, because I like doing that. So we're in a position where there are far less people on the drop zone than are meant to be there, but that isn't necessarily going to affect the outcome, because we know from other airborne operations, different nations, that if the drop zone's under fire, in this case there are Fallschirmjäger with heavy machine guns on the actual drop zone, maybe you don't want more people landing there because you're just incurring more casualties. In this case, it might be better to have people who are 2 or 3 miles away from the drop zone, who can then gather their senses, work out where they are, move in. And this is that again, that paradoxical nature of airborne forces, that ideally having a force together intact and strong is the best option. But at the same time, if you're on your own, you've got time to react before so it's always a balancing act between shock and awe, surprise, having people together, and also this ability to move people in from elsewhere. Because as Greg talked about on Monday, the Germans had the similar problem in Crete of being scattered over a large area and not enough there. But then they managed to get their resolve. They started working out where they were, and as we get in Normandy, the same thing happened with the Americans, the British there. So there's again, although I'll let you get back to your presentation in a minute, I think those of us who are watching this who are less familiar with the Sicily jumps than we are perhaps other jumps, there are many, many parallels to both Normandy and Market Garden and the German and indeed Russian jumps as well. And I'm surprised more people haven't studied this operation to look at where it went wrong. I mean, we know it came up in the sidebar. The friendly fire issue, to a certain extent, was cured with Normandy by the black and white invasion stripes. I mean, not completely cured, but they addressed that with a solution. And the C-47 pilots for later operations had much more training of the exact routes and sticking on those flight paths and doing it again. But so there is a learning curve, and the Allies are learning. But at the same time, as we will find out with your comparisons to Market Garden, there are other mistakes that are being repeated. Even though they've learned them once, they're having to learn them repeatedly. But anyway, I'll take you back to the ground there. So it's so far fewer paratroopers there than are supposed to be there. The Germans are already on the drop zone. There are paratroopers back in North Africa now, can't get back into play immediately. What's happening with the landings on the coast at this point? That's still working reasonably well, isn't it? Yeah,
so the ground forces sort of they're now inland. It's not stalemate, but it's certainly harder fighting now. So they're on plan at dawn. So as the paratroopers are going in that night, at dawn, the ground forces were to advance. It's actually at the same time this was happening as a bridge the Royal Marines were taking nearby, which we could come on later on, the Malati Bridge. So the ground forces were to relieve the Malati Bridge and then move on to Primosole Bridge. So that was their plan. I say, and we'll cover off why they didn't get there in time later on. But yeah, in theory, everything was kind of green lighted for them to be at Primosole Bridge by lunchtime the next day. That's when the paras were due to be relieved. So the jumping in sort of in the night, 12 hours holding the bridge, that's the plan. And again, going back to sort of the scattered drop, it wasn't until about lunchtime the next day the Germans actually realised Primosole Bridge was the target. because they've been scattered over so many and close to so many sort of strategic places. It leads to a confused intelligence picture with no clear objective. So Johnny 1 was fairly clear, but it wasn't understood until the next sort of lunchtime that Primosole Bridge was the main objective of this operation. And as you see here, here's the bridge. So in sort of typical paratrooper fashion, due to the confusion of the jump, it's always left to sort of the junior commanders to grab a few people together and advance to the target, which is what happened here. So this is the south end of the bridge looking north, and just to the sort of left of the picture, you can see a house there, which we're coming to the next slide as well. So that's going to be the start of the attack on the bridge to seize the bridge. So that will be used as a forming up point, an FUP. This is a close up here. You can see the house, and just in front of that is the two stripy pillboxes either side at the north end of the bridge. So Captain ran from 1 para. He managed to arrive at the house with about 50 guys, mixture of mostly 1 para and a few 3 para that have been picked up en route. On getting to the target, he sent forward Lieutenant Lazenby with a patrol of about 7 guys to basically have a look at the bridge and see what's happening. Lazenby returned after 15 minutes and said it's basically all quiet. You can see a few Italian sentries, but absolutely none the wiser there's a parachute operation to capture the Primosole Bridge. So the element of surprise was massively still there, which was an absolute bonus for the paras. So they quickly formed themselves into 3 groups in sort of classic military doctrine. You have the sort of the assaulting group, the cover party, and a reserve force. So by the house was the cover party in a reserve, ready to lay down fire on the 2 pillboxes that you can see there. So Rand basically led his group, charging and firing at the 2 pillboxes with the covering fire. As they approached the 2 pillboxes, they captured around sort of 20-30 Italian prisoners, came out of there and surrendered straight away. And as the reserve group then were looking to push past and go and capture the south end, Captain Rand basically kept the momentum up, and he basically ran straight over the bridge to the south end. Exactly the same scenario, took out the 2 pillboxes and took around 20-30 Italian prisoners. So after all the planning, all the confusion of the drop, 2,000 troops have been taken onto the plan to be taken onto this target. It took 50 guys 3 minutes to capture the bridge. So that was the fighting. So very similar to sort of other bridges like Pegasus Bridge in Normandy. So actually taking the bridge was fairly easy and achieved, to say, in only 3 minutes. Which is pretty good going. So the first job they had once the bridge was captured, as you see, this is a sketch from Peter Stainforth. So he was actually in the Royal Engineers on the bridge, and you see the engineers going straight to work, basically taking out. The bridge was rigged for demolition. So there's 30 sacks, 9 kilos each in the legs of the bridge waiting to be blown. So the engineers poured all of that sort of explosive into the river and started cutting the cables all over the bridge to make sure it wasn't detonated. It took them about 15 minutes to sort of take all the demolition kit off the bridge, and they figured it would take about 4 hours for the Germans to put it all back. So straight away the paras knew by capturing the bridge, they'd kind of had a 4-hour gap there. The bridge couldn't be demolished at least. And you can also see in the picture the pillbox, the paras are in there taking out German telemines and Italian machine guns ready to incorporate due to loss of their own support weapons. And then in sort of the top left corner, you can see one of the gliders. So this is one of the few gliders that actually landed on target, actually bounced and skimmed off the roof of the bridge as it came into land, breaking in half, which is designed to do, and take out the Jeep and a 6-pounder to get that into the defences. So the actual attack and sort of the de-rigging of the demolitions on the bridge went really well, and the bridge was now in British hands. So the first contact from the enemy now, you see here, again, this is the bridge, and some paras there with a Piat anti-tank weapon. So about 3:30 in the morning, a German and Italian convoy came over the bridge, completely unaware it had been captured from the north end. They were driving from Catania. As they approached the bridge, the paras let them get right onto the bridge and then took the first 3 vehicles out with machine guns and the Piats, at which point the convoy basically turned around and disappeared back to Catania. It was at this point that then Brigadier Lathbury arrived at the bridge. He'd seen the firefight on the bridge, assumed the bridge was being contested, so he moved up to the bridge where he was told that actually the bridge had been taken. It was just an enemy convoy. The convoy and the vehicle hadn't been cleared. They were still being cleared by 1 para guys, so still Italian enemy on the bridge. And one of these threw a grenade at Brigadier Lathbury, exploding, sending shrapnel into the back of his legs. So he was basically out of action straight away as soon as he got to the bridge, and handed command over to Colonel Pearson from 1 para for defence of the bridge. So Lathbury was now at the bridge, and you can see from the map here, this is sort of taking a step back. This is towards the plan. This is how it should have looked. And you can see in the next slide, obviously 3 para to the north, 2 para on the hills, and then 1 para at the bridge. That's kind of how it should be. As saying, you can see on the next slide kind of how it was and what actually happened. So you're looking at kind of this on the ground. This is the result of the drop and what was missing. So 3 para now to the north are about 30 people strong, and they had to pull much closer to the bridge to have basically contact with 1 para. 1 para very, very thinly defending the bridge, but they had taken it. And then 2 para to the south. They'd moved over Johnny 2, found it unoccupied, and moved on to Johnny 1 and set up on Johnny 1. Due to lack of troops and lack of support weapons, they centralised on just 1 hill. So that was what Lathbury was dealing with. So he captured his objectives, but they're very, very thinly held. And we're now waiting for daybreak and then a resulting Fallschirmjäger reaction, which they knew wouldn't be very far away.
And just to jump in again, Mark, because I like jumping in, the 2 things I'm coming away with, and I'm hoping our viewers are coming away with, are the real importance of a swift coup de main party right then. It doesn't necessarily have to be very big. We think of Pegasus Bridge, we think of perhaps what the could have been, and I know you're going to cover this later when you get to Arnhem. I'm also thinking about this very interesting what you said about the Fallschirmjäger not realizing till quite late in the day exactly what the objective is. I'm supposing that this is one of the things that brings the development of decoy paratroopers. Again, for Normandy, to cover what the actual airborne landings are doing, you have the Ruperts dropped. I know it wasn't as widespread as the Longest Day shows, but the Jedburgh teams, SAS, this idea of covering what you're actually doing by a whole series of similar actions that are also suggesting the enemy that something's going on. Because in this case, the real dispersal of jumps by real paratroopers is causing the Germans to not know where to go. But if you can get the enemy to move somewhere without actually using real personnel, by the use of Jedburgh teams on the ground, resistance signals, smoke panels, and decoy paratroopers, you're giving your coup de main party a bit of a head start. And I'm also thinking, the names you're throwing out here, Pearson, Frost, Lathbury, these guys, the experience they're getting here of a plan that has been worked out quite well, has gone completely tits up on the day, and yet you can adapt, you can overcome, you can put the small groups together. You're relying on this esprit de corps, the paratrooper spirit, the we're better than everybody else. And I'm sure these are lessons. I mean, Pearson and Hill are absolute heroes of mine from Normandy. Lathbury, of course, from Market Garden. But these are hard fought, hard learned lessons here, and it's really interesting to look at progress and chart the kind of development of airborne tactics.
Yeah, and say the title of the book, The First British Defile. This is that experience. These guys it's only a year later they're doing Arnhem, so they're literally kind of having a dry run here of Arnhem, so that they got a lot of experience to draw on, and so there's a lot of similarities that happen later on. So yeah, so I mean, going back to the Fallschirmjäger, I mean the Fallschirmjäger you can see on the map here, they're around the area of sort of DZ3 to sort of the southwest. So they were literally had no idea of the strategic importance. They knew the bridge was there. Obviously, they're trying to hold it themselves, but they were literally under attack from paratroopers jumping right on top of them. So as they were expecting their own reinforcements, the first wave of 2 para actually weren't engaged because the Fallschirmjäger believed it was their own reinforcements. It wasn't until the second wave came in, and then realised it was British paras in Dakota aircraft, and they started firing. But we said at the start of the show there about the sort of the quarter was shown to them. So as a kind of chivalry piece, the Fallschirmjäger, they would fire at the aircraft, but once the British paratroopers were in there, they wouldn't fire at the paratroopers, and that was seen as a sign of sort of to their sort of fellow paratroopers that they wouldn't shoot them in the air in their harnesses. So they literally take them prisoners as soon as they landed on the floor, but not attack them before then. So we're up on sort of Johnny 1 now. So at daylight, Johnny 1 had been taken by 2 para. They'd fought against the Italians who were based on the hills, and the Germans had put themselves on the low ground and put the Italians on top of the hills. So they're taking the hills against the Italians and taking them prisoner. Now at daylight, the Fallschirmjäger basically had realised they're on Johnny 2 and Johnny 1. They'd been seen in the night, the British paras. So they rolled over Johnny 2, no British there, so they took that as a fire support base. And then they started moving on foot towards Johnny 1, when they quickly realised 2 para were basically surrounded and bottled up on there. So the key sort of support weapon battle happened now in that 2 para, they basically had 12 Vickers machine guns, and they only had 1 after the drop, so missing 11 machine guns. 2 out of 12 mortars they had, 3 out of 27 Piats, and 3 out of 12 6-pounders. So massively short on weapons. Whereas the Fallschirmjäger had all their weapons intact. I managed to drag those up to Johnny 2 and Johnny 3 and start pouring fire down onto the 2 para positions. And that's what preceded the Fallschirmjäger coming in with the ground assault. And the whole scrub around sort of the Johnny 1 hill caught a light and started a rolling sort of cloud of smoke going up the hill, and the Fallschirmjäger just advanced behind that, and pretty quickly into the sort of the front trenches of 2 para. There's nowhere then for 2 para to dig in. It's hard ground, not a lot of vegetation or tree cover, no buildings, and they're trying to sort of dig in whilst being basically attacked and weren't able to fire back, was the key thing. So they're being suppressed and attacked without being able to fight back, until the sort of the Fallschirmjäger got to sort of hand-to-hand fighting where the sort of the paras were able to sort of match them. And just as they sort of got close to being overrun, you see from this picture here, second right is Captain Veer Hodge, who's a forward observation officer, calling in coastal fire from the ships out at sea. He managed to get radio comms with HMS Newfoundland. At the very last minute, brought in some naval air support, some naval fire support, which broke up the Fallschirmjäger attacks. And then the mortar platoon of 2 para found a captured Italian artillery piece, and also put that into action as well and started firing at the Germans. And it was those 2 actions that basically stopped the Fallschirmjäger in their tracks, and they withdrew from Johnny 1, and basically left 2 para to their own devices on top of the hill, completely isolated and pinned down from support weapons. So the Fallschirmjäger realised there's troops at Primosole Bridge was where they needed to be. Leave 2 para bottles up on Johnny 1, but from Lathbury's perspective and the paras at the bridge, they heard all the Johnny 2, the Johnny 1 fighting, and then it suddenly went silent. So to their mind, 2 para had been wiped out, and the hill had been taken. So they were at the bridge on their own, expecting attacks from north and south. So soon after 2 para had gone silent, they then faced their first attack from the north, from Catania. So this was a Fallschirmjäger attack. So about 10:30 in the morning, a motorcycle dispatch rider across the bridge, going between 2 Fallschirmjäger units. And as he came to the Primosole Bridge, was put under fire, quickly managed to get away, get back to Catania, and report that the bridge was in British hands. That was the first concrete evidence that Primosole Bridge was in British hands. Captain Stangenberg for the Fallschirmjäger quickly got his guys together. Within about an hour, was back at the bridge in lorries, and started debussing his infantry to basically advance to contact on the bridge. Little do you know that the British paras had already sighted their mortars and machine guns on likely enemy targets on the ground, and Stangenberg's men basically debussed from their vehicles straight into where the mortars were targeted. So as soon as they began to advance, they were hit with machine gun and mortar fire. Quickly U-turned back to Catania, and wasting no time, Stangenberg pulled together clerks, chefs, drivers, everyone into sort of a composite battle group, as the Germans were so well known for doing in Russia and later on in the war, and was then looking at coming back and attacking in greater numbers. He came back as well with a bit more planning this time. So he ran phone lines to the nearby artillery batteries, and we can see from the slide here that we had an hour's shelling came in and hit the south end, wrong the north end of the bridge, which was pinning sort of 1 and 3 para down. Under this artillery bombardment, 2 sides of the road, the paras started, the German Fallschirmjäger started attacking, and started getting into the front trenches of the paras, whereby the artillery then moved onto the bridge in the south end, and this was again supported by Messerschmitt air support. So it was a really sort of set piece battle against paras who were basically using light arms, low on ammunition, jumped in the night before, low on food, low on water, and they're now facing this formidable Fallschirmjäger enemy. So there's a lot of fighting.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but that both sides are now showing the ability they have of, they've got really good solid tactical understanding. The non-coms, the platoon commanders are very good at putting together these improvised but nevertheless very, very worthwhile and successful little ground maneuvers, because this isn't in the planning, this kind of putting this kind of thing together for both sides. So both, if for students of airborne forces, you're seeing both the Fallschirmjäger and the paras demonstrating exactly what they've been good at, because we so often focus on their ability to jump out of aircraft and neat landings, but actually that's only a tiny part of what makes an airborne soldier an airborne soldier. It's that extra level of training, that reliance on small units that depend, you're not going to be like an infantry unit always going to have mortar support and artillery support, and you are there, and all you've got is the soldier to your left and the soldier to your right. And I think it's a really good example, and your book highlights this, of this ability these guys have to solve problems quickly and immediately on the battlefield, and the only thing that's stopping either side doing really well in the sense is that they're meeting people of the same caliber as they are. If it had been, for example, an Italian infantry unit coming down that hill, you can't see that they would have overcome the paratroopers, and conversely, had the Fallschirmjäger been attacking a non-British airborne unit, they might have done better. But because they're both meeting people of equal ability, they're kind of cancelling each other out to a certain extent, until you mentioned the fact that the British are bringing in naval support, which is a bit of a game changer for us, and eventually the reinforcements come. But it's a fascinating insight into what makes these guys really good airborne soldiers.
Yeah, so the first attack by Stangenberg was actually beaten back by 1 and 3 para, but it just was using precious ammunition to sort of to push them back. So they assumed the Fallschirmjäger with classic airborne force would then launch a counter-attack straight away, which they did. But the British paras weren't expecting the counter-attack to be in exactly the same place, which it was. So 1 and 3 para didn't have a break, and Stangenberg launched a second attack straight into the same part of the line, when the guys were basically still reloading weapons from the first contact. So and this second attack managed to push the Fallschirmjäger and the British paratroopers into the same trenches, and you're seeing the hand-to-hand fighting now. So the paras, both sides, Green and Red Devils, absolutely mixed into trenches, hand-to-hand fighting, and that's no man's land had been taken away now. So that there's the north end of the bridge is really under sort of stress, and it was just allowing the paratroopers to be pushed back. And you're seeing the Germans as well, that they're being bussed from Catania, not very far away. Fresh troops, fresh ammunition, air support, artillery support, and every round that the British fired, that was one round less that they had. And they're getting more and more tired, taking casualties. And you can just see the scales generally starting to tip now. And it is that classic, even though they're against Fallschirmjäger, it's a classic kind of paratrooper small arms were coming up against bigger weaponry. And really struggling. And it's at this point of the battle now where it's becoming quite significant. They should have been being relieved from the ground forces. This is the key things that they've achieved, or their objective. They've already been fighting and been bombarded with artillery for about 2 hours longer than they should have been. They should have had tank support, and the bridge should have been taken. British forces should have been pushed onto Catania at this point. So really, this point of the battle should almost kind of never have happened. And you see from this slide now, you're looking at kind of Bren guns with the short range small arms against 88mm guns and aircraft. So it was the classic kind of airborne troops cut off, not reinforced by ground forces, and this is kind of the consequences which are playing themselves out for the rest of the day now. So 3 o'clock in the afternoon now, you're looking at the bridge again. To the left of the screen is the north end. The Germans put in a massive artillery bombardment, really pinning down the British, allowing the Fallschirmjäger to advance, more hand-to-hand fighting, and the 2 pillboxes at the north end were knocked out at this point. And at sort of 1700 hours, German armoured fighting vehicles and Stuks, self-propelled guns were seen entering the battlefield for the first time. If we look at the map here, and this is kind of what was going on in the ground, so you can see fresh troops arriving all the time from Catania. Fallschirmjäger now moving from the south, with 2 para bottled up, so they're being attacked from the south, and the Germans then putting a flanking attack on the north end of the bridge as well. So the pressure was getting huge, and at 1730, the decision was taken by Pearson Lathbury to pull back to the south end of the bridge and just hold on to one end of the bridge. At least you could deny the bridge to the Germans, even if you couldn't hold both ends. So put a huge machine gun barrage up, and then 3 para ran straight across the bridge back to the south end, which obviously attracted fire, so therefore 1 para couldn't take the same route and had to wade back through the river. Carried out in quick time, and the whole first Parachute Brigade was on the south bank, dug in and awaiting a response from the Germans. It took the Germans by surprise so much, it took half an hour for them to actually advance warily up to the bridge and realise the paras had actually gone. and their initial reaction was a headlong charge, infantry charge across the bridge, which was repulsed by machine gun fire from the south end. At this stage now, you see Fassel with the engineer battalion. He'd put in a flanking move on the north end. He now put one across the river, and he was basically getting in amongst the trenches on the right-hand flank of the Paras now. So it was a kind of really serious situation. They only held the south end of the bridge and had been hit by artillery fire, which had taken out the two pillboxes at the south end as well. So you got paratroopers with light arms in small shell scrapes facing an absolute onslaught, pretty much from 360 degrees. So this decision was taken by Lathbury about half 7 that night to basically wait for dark and then tactically withdraw his troops back to Johnny 1 in the hope that 2 Para was still there but just bottled up. Worst case scenario, they'd have to fight for Johnny 1 and try and secure that position to then provide fire over the bridge. If they couldn't hold the bridge, they could pour fire down onto the bridge with what they had left, and basically be a problem until ground forces arrived. So that's kind of the afternoon, and the Paras were just literally overwhelmed by pure numbers.
And at this point, Mark, again, you know, you're a former para, and you've looked at what the men who fought in this battle said, and their oral histories. How difficult is it then for the commanders to keep morale up when you have fallen back? You know, they, as you said, they had seized the bridge. I know there's overwhelming odds coming in. They're coming from every direction. There's artillery, but you have still, nevertheless, been beaten back from something you did once hold through no fault of your own, and it's not your fault that reinforcements are there. But this is where leadership and giving your men the belief that you're still doing the right thing. This falling back is tactical. There's a reason for it. We're gonna. How critical are those moments there to not let your men lose their spirit?
Yeah, it's a hallmark of airborne forces. You know, when you go behind enemy lines, you're going to be outnumbered and cut off, and essentially ground forces won't arrive. And all that experience is from operations such as Primosole Bridge and Arnhem over the years. So at every step of the way, there's objectives. You're never out of the fight. So despite the scattered drop, you still took the bridge. Still held the north end. Even when they couldn't hold the north end, they still held the south end. And even now, they're looking at moving back and fighting again for Johnny 1 to use that hill to dominate and try and link up with the relieving ground forces. So and here you can see some of the relieving ground forces. So the question was, where were they basically? And what you're seeing here, this is the relieving ground force. This is the spearhead. So at the start line is the kind of the wall in the background. As they moved off at dawn to relieve the paratroopers, 6 of the 7 Shermans leading the attack were knocked out straight away. Literally, you know, they've only gone yards from the start line. So that's where a lot of the armoured support was gone, and therefore the ground forces then had to advance on foot, which caused huge delays. As every time they got to a kind of a population centre or strategic point, they started falling prey to the German rearguard actions. So about mid-afternoon, they arrived at the Malati Bridge, where the commandos were a few kilometres away from Primosole Bridge. So as a sort of a side note, that the Marines had come in as the Paras were flying in the night before. The Marines came in by sea, marched across, took the Malati Bridge, very similar to Primosole Bridge, held it, and then basically were overwhelmed by armoured German units. The ground forces didn't arrive in time. So again, there's just this constant pattern of the ground forces not being there in time. So they finally managed to get about a mile south of Johnny 1. So at the same time, the Paras were basically made a decision to withdraw from the bridge. The advanced elements of the relief force arrived just about a mile south of Johnny 1 and stopped. So 2 Paras seeing this quickly went down there to try and push them up into the attack. And the ground forces were adamant they would not move until the morning when they had further fire support from artillery that was also moving up. So yeah, I mean, it's a huge sort of bugbear for the Paras. Had fought all that time. The prize was there, and a quick armoured push now would have well got the Primosole Bridge back into their hands against the sort of unorganised infantry. But instead, they waited on Johnny 1, which 2 Paras was still there. The rest of 1 Para Brigade moved back to Johnny 1, so the whole Para Brigade now was on Johnny 1. And the ground forces basically harboured up for the night, so waited, organised themselves, had a night's sleep. And the plan was to basically attack the bridge, Primosole Bridge, in the morning, which is what happened. So overnight, Unbeknownst to friendly forces, the Fallschirmjäger, another 450 were airlifted in, parachuted in around Catania, moved straight to the bridge. So again, another masterstroke of the Fallschirmjäger and the sort of the rapidness of how they could quickly get on the battlefield. More troops, more ammunition, and they were sat there basically waiting for the Durham Light Infantry, who were going to make the attack the next morning. So the 9th Battalion DLI marched towards the bridge. Fallschirmjäger waited to the very last moment, opened fire. They managed to get across the bridge to the north end, but they were beaten back, suffering severe casualties and tanks knocked out as well. Later that afternoon, Montgomery arrives at Johnny 1 on the battlefield, and he's now obviously in that kind of race with Patton is starting to hot up, and the Primosole Bridge was taking on huge strategic implications. So yeah, Montgomery orders a huge artillery bombardment to go in on the bridge, and orders a second DLI attack in the morning. The DLI plan, a famously sort of bone of contention with the airborne forces, it's going to be a carbon copy of the first attack. It was Alistair Pearson, CEO of 1 Para, basically stood up at the O group and said, "Don't do it that way. You lose the whole battalion. So I'll take this to a forwarding point a couple of miles downstream, and I'll flank you and bring you into the bridge," which is what happened. But Pearson told the DLI to push off and get away from the bridge to allow reinforcements to come over from the south end, which didn't happen. They spent hard days fighting with the Fallschirmjäger, 100% casualties at one point on both sides, before a further attack was put in the next day, and the bridge was finally taken and secured. So I didn't know if you want to come in with your video.
Yeah, we'll do that. And I just, Colin Taylor, my mate, and normally is watching, who is currently working on a project about 9 DLI. So he been sitting here waiting with bated breath for a mention of, in his view, and possibly mine as well, another group of unsung heroes there. And I know you're going to go through some of the connections with Market Garden, but this idea that the relieving force, the armor, have not quite grasped the urgency of the airborne forces is so much like the Market Garden problem. And you wonder whether if there'd been some airborne advisors embedded with the relieving force, they could have somehow got across this urgency. If perhaps they had radio, there are forward observers with the airborne to give in naval fire. Could there not be airborne observers with the relieving force to have communication, sort of say, look, they're telling you if you make that move now, you can do this now. But I mean, it's not that the armored push is necessarily doing the wrong thing. They're playing it the way they're playing it, but it's the schedule difference between airborne forces and ground forces. Pritt said the same thing last night about the Soviets. In fact, the operation of Vyazma, it was because the ground force was a cavalry officer, and cavalry officers, maybe they have this sense of speed and urgency that perhaps was needed. But this is armored again, but its armor can't move without infantry can't move without the artillery support, that and everything. It becomes only as fast as the slowest moving element, and maybe in this case what you want is a bit more dash, a little bit more of a risk taking, because as you've outlined brilliantly, the airborne forces have been showing dash and brilliance and initiative for hours now, and they just need someone to kind of match their game at this point, I suppose. But yeah, folks, this is footage I took 3 or 4 years ago in Sicily. It just gives you an idea where I had some questions about what the terrain is like. Obviously, there's a big new modern bridge now. And if you are traveling to Sicily, and we have people watching the show who are from that area there, Mark's going to talk about the projects there to commemorate them. I mean, the memorials come out in a minute, but it's you can still sense the importance of it being the only crossing point. So I'll play this there. It's just silence. So if you want to jump in any comments, then please do. But this is looking at the bridge there. So you can see Etna in the background there, folks. And over to the right is the sea, the estuary, and then in a minute I'll be down there with my camera near where the monuments are. So coming from Normandy, going to Sicily, I'm expecting to see maybe more monuments than there really are, because Normandy you kind of can't walk without there's 2,500 monuments in Normandy or something. But from you've been to this battlefield, it is definitely marked and acknowledged there. This is to the Italians here, this one, isn't it? So run us through what we've got in the area.
Yeah, so the bridge itself, you can see the feet of the bridge itself. That's it. But obviously, you're looking at the modern motorway bridge. So the monument you've got there is actually, I was going to name drop a couple of guys in Sicily who maintain all these projects. So you've got Albert D'Agato from La Guerra in Sicilia group, and Marco Gimolero. So he's from the Federazione Nazionale di Italia. So two groups there, and they basically sort of spend all their spare time putting these monuments up, finding pillboxes, cleaning them up, and just maintaining the whole sort of Sicilian battlefield area. So it's a huge sort of unsung work that they're doing. So to try and support that, we're looking at a parachute measurement piece, potentially a jump, who knows, after the pandemic, and try and get some more sort of awareness of the battle there. So yeah, so it's not the original World War II bridge that's gone, similar to many World War II bridges now. And to the south, the Johnny One Hill, half the hill has literally been quarried away. There's a huge quarrying business there, and half the hill has literally just been dug up and moved. So unfortunately, it's not the best preserved battlefield, but you can still see the key areas there, and you can see from this video how flat the ground is. And there's no cover. You're in the grass. It's covered from view, but not covered from fire. So any rounds or machine gun bullets that are coming in, you've got no protection. And that's obviously at some point the front line was the river itself, which is only sort of 20, 30 meters. So you can see the difficulties there, and there's Mount Etna in the distance. Obviously, some of the powers are up there at the time of the jump. So that's how important. And just the other side of Mount Etna is Messina, and that's the end goal. So you can see how strategic this bridge is. Over this bridge, and you're on land all the way to Messina. So it's a key bridge. Yeah,
I was surprised that monument there to DLI, how kind of I felt I was going to the wrong place. I was following instructions. I thought it can't be down here, surely, and it was down there. It didn't have that sense of arriving into memorial area you get with some of the other battlefields. But yeah, we'll wind up the Sicily campaign. Well, you've kind of done it there. Once they get past Catania, it's sort of open road then, and Patton's done his bit there, and not that many more days to go. But it all worked out. Yeah, this is footage I took at the cemetery, Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery. So I'll let you run through the casualties, what happened to these forces in the days that followed, and what the immediate reaction was for these survivors. Did they feel let down? Is there connections with Mahigard in that respect?
Yeah, so I think so it was a cemetery in Catania. So I think the key piece after this battle as well is that the survivors were moved to Syracuse, put on a ship, and they actually bombed that night by the Luftwaffe, and then made their way back to North Africa. It's only when they got back to North Africa they realised the extent of what had happened. Where were all their sort of comrades? Where were they? They didn't know if they were scattered in Sicily. They didn't realise until they got back to North Africa that sort of 5/6 of the force was still in North Africa. It's only a small section actually fought. So around 295 guys fought around Primosole Bridge. That was it. So pretty small element. So 27 killed, 75 wounded, and prisoners of war as well. So of that force, half were sort of casualties. So but it's the positive thing spin on this is that you can see what parachute and airborne forces can do with a plan that goes wrong, with limited numbers, a lot of weapons missing, up against a superior enemy, and they can still do the job. If obviously the key here is to be relieved by ground forces, they can't fight forever on their own. So that was also a key lesson that wasn't learned in other areas such as Arnhem. So yeah, so you're seeing at the cemetery here. So this is the Parazan and other units that were killed in sort of the Catania area. But yeah, it sort of just shows that the price that was paid ultimately for a lot of guys out there, and that shows again how important Primosole Bridge was. It wasn't at the start of the plan. It wasn't a huge strategic bridge. It was strategic, but not a linchpin. It actually became the delay at Primosole Bridge was probably the defining feature that stopped Montgomery getting to Messina before Patton. That's how big it became at Primosole Bridge, which then had also the following implications for wider Europe and Market Garden, and the narrow versus broad front strategy, and the kind of the niggling between Patton and Montgomery up to Eisenhower. So a huge knock-on effects what happened at Primosole Bridge and that delay in the Sicily campaign and wider. So yeah, huge strategic implications of Primosole Bridge.
And yet, the lessons aren't really learned. Is it because, in the grand scheme of things, with Sicily and, as you just said, the Patton Montgomery debate, endless discussion, that when you're considering the entire casualties for the campaign, because there were so few paras actually on the ground in the right place, their heavy casualties are high as a percentage, but not necessarily high when you compare it with the casualties of the entire Operation Husky. So is that maybe one of the reasons why perhaps the lessons weren't learned as well as they should have been, or is it just that the higher ups still didn't really know what they wanted to do with airborne forces?
Yes, I mean, ultimately the Primosole Bridge was taken, so it was a success, but it could have been taken a lot easier with less casualties. So it's always going to beg that question: if sort of 300 guys who were scattered could still take a bridge, what would a whole brigade intact, landing on time, etc., etc.? What would they have achieved? You'd assume they'd have taken a bridge a lot easier, defended it a lot better. The Fallschirmjäger should never have been there. So they should have literally taken this bridge and allowed Montgomery just to drive straight over up to Messina. So it could have spun the whole campaign. Montgomery should have been in Messina. Maybe Patton wouldn't even attempted to go for Messina if it had been that easy for Montgomery. So yeah, big knock-on effect. And the picture you're seeing here is kind of raises the question of how much of a victory or defeat was Sicily in the grand scheme of things. So only 6 days after Sicily was the invasion of Italy. And the Germans have managed to get 70,000 troops across the Straits of Messina back to Italy. So some of the first troops the Allies faced on landing in Italy were troops that had been evacuated from Sicily. And the last German boat that moved out of Sicily was actually towing a bottle of champagne in celebration at kind of the rearguard action they had fought. And ultimately, the objectives of Sicily have been achieved. Italy and Mussolini had been knocked out of the war. They'd opened a second front for the Russians. And it opened the sea lane. So the 3 objectives have been hit. For the parachute guys, Churchill took a specific interest in this. He's very interested in the parachute regiment, and he saw a memo saying that 1,100 paratroopers and airborne troops were still missing at the end of the Sicily campaign out of 3,600. So almost a third of airborne troops were still listed as missing, which Churchill called a very serious disaster. So that's the implications there, as well as the friendly fire incidents earlier on. There's huge lessons for the airborne forces to take forward, which some learned and some weren't learned for Arnhem, which we'll come on to.
Well, indeed, and let's talk about some of the lessons that are learned. So certainly, and this was not so much about Primosole Bridge, but it was about airborne operations in general in Sicily. The friendly fire issue is to some extent addressed with invasion strikes for Normandy. I know there's other jumps into Italy that in between those, but that takes some time to develop. What do you think are the positive takeaways that were implemented, and then we'll do the negatives that weren't? What are the positives?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of the potential of airborne forces have been realised. It was quite in North Africa. It's quite amateurish. A lot of the pilots, the Dakota pilots that went into Sicily and Africa, were civilian aircraft pilots before the war. They weren't that seasoned and experienced. So going forward, the Paras had their sort of dedicated air support units, better navigation training for the pilots, air corridors to avoid friendly fire, and obviously the black and white stripes on the aircraft. Simple things. Which made a big difference and professionalised the Paras. If you're going to put the Paras behind enemy lines to capture a bridge, you need to do it properly, and you need to support them by ground forces. So I think it was just a strategic thinking at the higher echelons of command, which is the key sort of takeaway. And it's simple things. So John Frostwood, he was well known for using the hunting horn on the drop zone, using the noise of that to gather his troops, and that was taken forward to Arnhem. A lot more of the hunting horns were used at Arnhem as a simple recognition piece. Radios throughout the whole Primosole Bridge, we haven't actually touched on it, but there's no communications with the outside world. It's only at one point Lathbury managed to sort of get a message out and call for airborne reinforcements that night, which he then had to cancel. And so radios and comms were improved for Arnhem, even though again they didn't work. But one thing they actually brought in was an automatic drop zone. So if there were no comms, resupply would be put on a pre-designated drop zone, which happened at Arnhem. Obviously, at that stage, they've been overrun by the Germans. That's why it's a big things made of in the films and stuff with the Germans taking all the kit. That is why that happened as a result of Primosole Bridge. We can also see that the missed intelligence picture at Arnhem, very similar to Primosole Bridge. Formations moved into the area. Even worse at Arnhem, you've got armoured units up against lightly armed paratroopers, which was a huge missed intelligence picture. And the drop zones, I mean, the actual plan at Primosole we've been through, I mean, it took the bridge from both sides of a river with the coup de main force. with blocking north and south. If you look at Arnhem, you can see the drop zone map here. There were big drop zones to try and make the dropping easier, but they were moved 10 miles away from the bridge. So it took time, and jeeps were meant to be used to try and get to Arnhem Bridge, but they were only taking the bridge from one side mainly. So some lessons you can see from Primosole Bridge were learned, but some certainly weren't. But the knowledge of Primosole Bridge, I say it's the same guys at Primosole Bridge fought at Arnhem, and a lot of the characters from Primosole Bridge are in the film Bridge Too Far. I'm sure a lot of people know that, John Frost amongst others. So a lot of those guys, Lathbury, were in the film, were at Primosole Bridge. So the future of the Parachute Regiment here, you can see guys fighting at Arnhem. This is one para. Alistair Pearson, he moved on to 8 para in Normandy, but every officer that he served with at Primosole Bridge, they were killed, wounded, or captured within a year. That sort of shows the highlight of the casualties inflicted on the Parachute Regiment. It's such a used unit. Same as the Fallschirmjäger. The Fallschirmjäger were used in offensive role in Crete, you saw earlier in your talk in the week. Later on, they're kind of a fire brigade. They'd just be flown in to plug gaps in the line. They had one more jump at the Battle of the Bulge. But really, the guys that fought the Fallschirmjäger that fought at Primosole Bridge, then they next popped up on the battlefield at Monte Cassino. They were kind of defensive specialists. That was their plan from then on. And then wider for the Parachute Regiment, I mean, we talked about some of the battle honours there from Primosole Bridge. Obviously, they moved on to Normandy, Arnhem, the Rhine, which is a huge airborne operation, and Athens, which is kind of another sort of relatively unknown battle in 1944 and 45. So, and the future of the Parachute Regiment now is it's an elite regiment, and a lot of that is based on what they did during the war. The nickname, the Red Devils, and all that history all came about. So, definitely bringing the Primosole Bridge battle to a wider audience helps with that regimental history.
And where do you think it sits? You know, if you go through Pete Cumbie today and you're 20 years old, you know, you probably haven't got a father or a grandfather who went through this campaign, because, you know, it was a long time ago. But where does it stand? Everyone's heard of Arnhem, everyone's heard of D-Day. Where does Sicily sit in the legends these days?
Yeah, I mean, the Parachute Regiment is absolutely dominated by Arnhem. I mean, it's literally a pilgrimage there every year, and it's on everyone's list to try and jump or go to Arnhem. So that is number one by a million miles, and closely followed by Normandy. So Primosole Bridge, it's kind of in that kind of gaggle underneath that. It's not that well known, and that was the sort of the whole objective of the book was to get the battle out there within the regiment as well. When I delivered a presentation to 3 and 4 para, and it's getting the younger guys to understand. This was the foundations of Arnhem, which is all very well known about. But the guys actually done this a year before, so the story is getting out there now, and it's good to see it's being delivered to a wider audience.
Yeah, and you know, as we said earlier, the inherent qualities of airborne soldiers having this extraordinary self-belief, ability to function in smaller than the normal units, improvise, overcome, hold on. All that is displayed in absolute spades in this operation here. The importance of leadership, and then also, as you said there, the loss of leadership going forward is that if you then lose these good guys, who are you going to have to come through to replace these guys? But so that you can see the brilliance of airborne forces, but you can also, I wonder where it. I mean, you hit it yourself. Is this a successful airborne operation, or is it an unsuccessful, or is it somewhere between the two? I mean, because as you said, the actual seizing of the bridge initially, you know, 30, 40 guys did it very, very quickly out of a brigade-sized intention. So that bit worked very well. But then later on, of course, with the losses, it can be easily perceived as not being a success, and maybe because it ultimately perhaps gets seen as not being entirely successful. Maybe the lessons aren't. Maybe it's not as studied as much as it should have been. I don't know. It's very hard to place it. This is the recurring theme we've talked about this week. Is this inability to really learn what to do with airborne forces? But you know, with regards to you shedding light on this, I think it's important that there is this legacy and there's this parallel with Market Garden and yet you can guarantee that. I mean, I attended a lecture by Colonel Frost years and years ago, and of course no questions came up about Bruneval or this. It was just Arnhem to the point where I sensed he was actually fed up with talking about it and quite bitter about it as well. And you know, you got a guy who had an incredible career, but yet it's only the one aspect of it that anyone wanted to know about. Pearson, of course, going to Normandy had a different reaction. But so with regards to, you said about these Sicilian contacts of yours wanting to put more monuments up there, how does the people of Sicily perceive this? They haven't got the Italians are involved in it in some way, but their respect is for the British and the Germans. Are they just interested in it as a battle, and the complexity of it to study as a neutral? What are their feelings about it?
Yeah, I think it's an ambiguous one. Obviously, it's fought on their homeland, so that's a kind of a key interest for them. But again, there's Italian formations, Arditi and others, Livorno, were involved around Primosole Bridge and Catania and wider Sicily. So, and it's one of them. It eventually knocked Italy out of the war, and Sicily's a fairly independent area within Italy. So there's a lot of both sides to the story there. So I suppose it's bittersweet for the Italians. There's casualties there. But ultimately it took them out of the war. So, but I say the guys in Sicily, Alberto and Marco, they're doing a sterling effort of preserving the battlefield and putting monuments up, and from pillboxes through to parts of airfields.
Yeah, well, kudos to them for doing that. So my last question is what are you working on now? Obviously, you're still trying to get this story out there, but in terms of as a military historian writing, what are you on at the moment?
Yeah, so two projects at the minute. One's looking at the second Para Brigade, which was the second operation in Sicily, which was cancelled. They were then moved to Italy and eventually went into Greece. So towards the end of the war, sort of a very sort of pet project of Winston Churchill was to basically save sort of Greece from the communist influence and keep it in the Allied camp. So he sent the Paras in there, 4, 5, and 6 Para. And it was a classic kind of modern day, almost Afghanistan type operation. Even like you see this week, 1, 2, and 3 Para all out in Kabul this week. So in Greece, they were went from peacekeeping to war fighting in a very short space of time, and it sort of shows the kind of all round character and skills of the Parachute Regiment. And they were handing out humanitarian food parcels in the morning and then fighting communist rebels in the afternoon. And Winston Churchill actually went out there on Christmas Day 1944. And that shows kind of how important the Athens battle was. Again, it's very, very not widely known, and which led to a Greek civil war. So again, and the Parachute Regiment were at the forefront of that. So it's bringing that element out next, and then also another project, hopefully to be published soon, is looking at Fidel Castro and cigars, which is another pet project and not military history. So yeah, I do like the old cigar. So. It's looking at the impact of Fidel Castro on the Cuban cigars globally. So two
I
projects.
wasn't expecting that. I was. You said before we went there was one was military and one wasn't, but I wasn't expecting cigars to come into the conversation. But anyway, we will thank you everybody for watching. That people are interested already in Bruneval, and by the way, we are going to be covering Bruneval and Operation Biting. Well, it's the same thing. February next year will be the 80th anniversary. So. I'm currently looking for presenters. I'm looking at maybe doing at least 3 or 4 days of shows about it. I think I want to do something on the ground, something about that being the first, not major, but first pivotal use of British airborne forces. So I'm planning that right now. Whether you or someone else wants to come on and do that, I'm looking for that right now. In terms of the book, as usual, folks, the link to the book is in the description below in YouTube, both UK and US. There is the book there. It's a nice, easy read. It's not overly complicated. It's not a Pediatric Adams. Take you a month to read it. You'll breeze through it. It's good. It's informative. I also encourage you to read about the Durham Light Infantry and the other units there, the 231 Brigade further south, because Urquhart, of course, he's not airborne yet. He's in Sicily, albeit it's the infantry role there. So many of the main players from Market Garden are involved peripherally or directly in the Sicily operations, and yet it doesn't really come up in the discussions of Market Garden. So all worth talking about. But right now, I will just remind people that this is the end of Airborne Week. Next week, it's a couple of nights of random shows. You've got Sarah Kovner coming on talking about Japanese POWs. And Edith Morante is coming on to talk about OSS Detachment 101. And then after that, Holocaust Week begins, which I know won't have to tell you is going to be a rather challenging week in terms of the content. It'll be lots of tears, and there'll be some uplifting stories as well. But I've got an amazing lineup of guests to come on and acknowledge the Holocaust. And then after that, Battle of Britain, then Arnhem, and then Eastern Front Week. That's September taken care of. So lots of stuff. So as usual, folks, please consider, if you're not already, becoming a patron. If you're not a subscriber of the channel, please become a subscriber. As I say, the link to Mark's books in the description below. Worth checking out that book, definitely. And as for that, it just remains me now to say thank you very much, Mark, for joining us. Did you enjoy it?
Brilliant. Yeah, so I've watched a few shows earlier in the week, and the comments chat, there's a lot of knowledgeable and passionate people there, so it's great. Hopefully everyone enjoyed it.
Sometimes I go back and read the comments, because when I'm hosting, I can't always read them all. I go back and read. Sometimes the conversation there seems to be better than what I'm talking about. I think I should get leave and have one of these come over to host. I can actually watch it for a change. Would be quite nice. But anyway, been really good. And as far as I'm concerned about Airborne Week, thank you, Greg. Thank you, Kevin, on Tuesday. Thank you, all my guests, Prit yesterday. James did a fantastic talk about the cancelled operations. And you finished off really well. And we didn't actually, except in passing, mention Normandy or Market Garden directly all week. We talked about the parallels and connections, but we didn't actually cover them. But we have covered both of them, and we'll have Arnhem Week in September. So there we are, folks. I will see you all again. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy your weekend. Oh, one thing, don't forget, folks, I'm guest hosting one of the quizmasters on the Fighting on Film World War II movie quiz tomorrow evening. So if you're not signed up for that, I think it's 7:30 or 8 o'clock UK time. Go to the Fighting on Film Twitter feed and sign up to that. Join via Zoom and have me as a quizmaster asking questions about war films. And yes, there's a whole category about Normandy. So it would be daft if there wasn't. So there we are, folks. This is Paul Woodadge. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Good night.